Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Antoinette Siu, the media and tech reporter here at TheWrap. I'm very happy to have you all join us here for 2021 Emmy Awards screening of The Social Dilemma with director and writer Jeff Orlowski, producer Larissa Rhodes, writer Vickie Curtis, composer Mark Crawford, sound designer Richard Gould, and editor and writer Davis Coombe. So we're going to be showing you a trailer before we kick off the conversation with our panelists today. And for anyone in the audience, please participate in the live chat on the stream, share with us your thoughts, and let us know where you're tuning in from today. So before we introduce our guests, let's take a look at the trailer.
When you go to Google and type in climate change is, you're going to see different results depending on where you live and the particular things that Google knows about your interests.
That's not by accident, that's a design technique.
What I want people to know is that everything they're doing online is being watched, is being tracked. Every single action you take is carefully monitored and recorded.
A lot of people think Google's just a search box and Facebook's just a place to see what my friends are doing. What they don't realize is there's entire teams of engineers whose job is to use your psychology against you.
I was the co-inventor of the Facebook like button.
I was the president of Pinterest,
Google, Twitter, Instagram.
There were meaningful changes happening around the world because of these platforms. I think we were naive about the flip side of that coin.
We get rewarded by hearts, likes, thumbs up, and we conflate that with value and we conflate it with truth.
A whole generation is more anxious, more depressed.
I always felt like fundamentally it was a force for good. I don't know if I feel that way anymore.
Facebook discovered that they were able to affect real-world behavior and emotions without ever triggering the user's awareness. They are completely clueless.
Fake news spreads 6 times faster than true news. We're being bombarded with rumors.
If everyone's entitled to their own facts, there's really no need for people to come together. In fact, there's really no need for people to interact.
We have less control over who we are and what we really believe.
If you want to control the population of your country, there has never been a tool as effective as Facebook.
We built these things and we have a responsibility to change it. The intention could be, how do we make the world better?
If technology creates mass chaos, loneliness, more polarization, more election hacking, more inability to focus on the real issues, we're toast.
This is checkmate on humanity.
Okay, welcome back. It's my pleasure to reintroduce our guests today, Jeff Orlowski, Larissa Rhodes, Vickie Curtis, Mark Crawford, Richard Gould, and Davis Coombe today. And why don't we get started with this conversation today? I'm very excited to have all of you join me today. I remember seeing this last year and was just fascinated by all of the people that you all interviewed and brought into the whole thing. And I wanted to start maybe if we could just say a brief introduction on what Social Dilemma is. I think a lot of people have come across or maybe have even seen it on Netflix by now. But for those who haven't seen it yet, what is Social Dilemma about?
Sure, I'll go ahead and jump in. But first of all, it's great to have the whole gang back together. It's been such a while since we worked on making the film, but we got started in this in 2017 when some friends of mine through college who worked within tech were starting to speak out against the industry that they worked for. And this really turned into an investigation into what is our technology doing to society? What is big social doing to society? And that really was the underlying question that drove the making of the film.
Yeah, and I think, Jeff, you just to follow up on that, I remember you were saying in your description about it starting out as just you and Tristan as friends were getting together casually before this even became an idea to turn it into a project, right? So tell me a little bit about when you guys sat down, what did you talk about? How did the conversation go?
Yeah, to take the story all the way back, there was a TED Talk back in 2011 or 2012 from Eli Pariser, and it was called "Beware the Online Filter Bubbles." It was something along those lines, and I remember talking about it with Larissa back then around like, this is a huge issue. This is a big concept. If our technology is filtering and separating each of us into our own individual feeds, that's going to have huge consequences. But Larissa and I couldn't figure out how we could make that into a visual film and what was interesting there. And so years later, when Tristan started speaking about this on the record and going as an insider from Google, that's when we saw an opportunity that there could be potentially a film here. And so I started meeting up with Tristan and following him around and just getting a sense of what he was thinking about. And he was talking to all of these people within the tech industry about a fundamental rethinking and a challenging of the underlying premise of what the technologies that they worked on were doing. And I think that was the earliest clue that we had something here. So we started going out and following him, started filming, started really trying to explore and to see what exactly, what's up with his life. Is there a movie to be made here? What would it look like? What could the shape be? We had that very early footage coming in, shared it with Davis and our editing team. We started reviewing through it. We did countless like foundational backbone master interviews with a number of both Tristan and people that he worked with, his colleagues and others that we were getting to meet, just to try to wrap our head around like, how could we possibly make a film about this issue? And so there was this big open exploratory phase for the first year or so, just trying to figure out like what kind of shape is this movie?
And from there, how did you, center it around him to look for other subjects in the documentary? I'm curious if you guys can also, maybe share a little bit about the process around, were people that you approached ready and willing to talk about Silicon Valley? Were they, coming from the tech world or formerly in tech? And were there people who were hesitant to talk about potentially their former employers at that point?
Yeah, absolutely. Larissa, do you want to jump in and take some of that?
Yeah, I can jump in. So during that time, obviously, we were having big story meetings trying to figure out how are we going to tell a story like this. And it was apparent to us that there were lots of different avenues and lots of different ways that we could follow different characters. And I think we were getting introduced to different subjects through every interview that we did. So we would do an interview and then somebody would say, oh, you've got to talk to so-and-so. And we'd have a call with them. And in some cases, it was difficult to get people to either want to talk about on camera their work, whether that was their involvement in the creation of these technologies, or really the reality of even understanding in some cases how the ramifications and how big this problem really was. On the flip side of that, there were also tons of people that were very eager to talk about the issues that they were seeing in the space and really wanting to be part of the solution, wanting to talk through, how they see their own involvement in that. So I think for us, it was really trying to figure out what is the balance? How do we ensure that we have both insiders from the space as well as experts who are outside of the space who are able to speak about the work that they had been either researching or writing about? Shoshana Zuboff, Kathy O'Neill, for example, who were really eloquent and able to kind of call out the tech industry and say, wait a second, all the things that we used to think were really helpful and great for our world actually really have some negative downstream consequences.
That's interesting. Was there, on the flip side of that, did you get any responses or reaction from any of those companies that were mentioned in the film? Did anyone reach out or any current employees have any thoughts after they saw it?
So much to speak to on that point. When we were making the film, we were trying to keep the film pretty tight and under wraps. We didn't want publicity about it. We didn't want it to get leaked out in advance for a whole number of reasons, but we really tried to keep the production pretty quiet. And so we didn't have any engagements with the companies formally while making the film itself. We were really getting access, as Larissa was sharing, kind of some of the process there, meeting an insider and getting connected to other people and doing our own outreach to find some of those executives and engineers and employees that would speak out on the record. After the film came out, that's when we started to see some of the first public responses, and Facebook issued a public response to the film a couple of weeks after the film came out. Facebook was the only company that issued a formal response in that fashion. And then, a couple of months later, January 6th happened, and I think Facebook changed a lot of their own actions publicly and from behind the scenes, from what we've heard, in terms of the way they operate since then, and some of the tensions and challenges that came up in January 6th. And when you look at the response to the film and then their later actions, I think you can see some of the shifts that were going on there as well.
Yeah, I think everyone joining us today on the panel was also involved with Chasing Coral, right? Your previous project.
Almost everyone.
Except for Richard. We just met Richard, yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Except for Richard.
But he feels like part of the team. He's just wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so that one was also really cool, just talking about the coral life and, you know, going into kind of a more investigative piece as well. I was wondering, you know, what was moving from that going into, you know, the tech space and talking about sometimes these are kind of abstract things that you have to show, whether it was, you know, some scenes around mental health or depression, and there were scenes of the political protests blowing up and everything. So what were some of the challenges in, you know, putting that on screen when you think about creating these moments?
Yeah, you know, it was interesting coming from a film that we'd made before, where we'd found an interesting way to show a problem to people in a way that hadn't seen it before, by witnessing the change happening to coral reefs. And we were, Jeff got me excited in this project by telling me that, you know, he had found a problem more serious than climate change, and then it became pretty apparent as soon as we started working on the film that it was going to be difficult to really show the scope of the threat and of the problem that we were trying to describe. And there were a lot of different iterations, but eventually the idea of this narrative that would be interwoven, a fictional narrative that would be interwoven, came up, and Vickie and Jeff kind of developed that, and Vickie should talk more about how that sort of came to take the shape that it ended up in.
Sure. Yeah, to jump back to even the beginning of this question, I think for me, the thing that I think of Chasing Coral and Social Dilemma as very related, and I know that that's not necessarily obvious on the plot, story, characters level, but they're both dealing with an existential crisis level problem, and existential crisis level problems are really hard to capture on screen, or at least certainly it's hard to capture the scope and magnitude, because you can't point your camera at all of humanity and say, look at what's at stake. So
we need the 10-year time lapse of all civilization plugged into their phones. That's the yep.
But we are talking about an existential crisis where there's something off with the way we're relating to the world, or there's something off with the way we're relating to each other through social media, through this third-party mediated manipulative platform. So I guess there were some questions about it that were the same, like how do we show this underlying illness that is part of modern society that we'd like to not look at, or maybe you're just fully unaware of. And then Jeff had the idea of, well, what if we show what's going on the other side of your phone screen? Like if we could just zoom into your phone and see what the algorithms were choosing, you know, however many times a second, making choices about what to show you and how to get you back and how to engage you. And so that's how we developed the idea of Vincent Kartheiser's character, the three algorithms that are all motivated to, you know, get your attention, show you the right ad at the right time, get you to invite more people onto the platform, so that more and more of the world takes place through their control rather than directly between you and another person, or you and a product, or you and the natural world. So so then we said, well, if we have these algorithms and they're all hell-bent on affecting change in one person's life, who is that one person? And that's how we came up with the story of the character Ben and his family, each sort of struggling with a different part of the beast of big social, whether it's social, you know, whether it's the opportunity for more bullying or political extremism, or kind of just tuning out of your real life and into your screen life. and the addiction aspect of it as well, trying to have the characters in that family all grappling with a different aspect of being a person in a world where 3 billion people are jacked into the system.
And I would add too that, to Davis's point, it's not necessarily that this problem is more important than climate change. I think it's that it's a foundational problem that's even causing some of the climate change denialism and issues that we've had in solving that problem. So I think it's important to just recognize that the information ecosystem that we're operating in is very much skewed by these companies and their platforms and that power.
Yeah, it was super interesting to see, you know, the stories within the stories and, you know, how you guys structured around that. I'm wondering also, you know, with so many things that it touches on in terms of this topic, was there anything that didn't make it into the final product that you know, wanted to talk about?
We debated for quite a while if this should be a series. And you know, making it 6 hours or 8 hours, we easily could have filled that much content. To Davis's camera left right now is a cork board, and we had that board filled just with like countless post-its and index cards around like all the different potential themes and ideas. And I think structuring this film was a huge challenge for us because there was just so much material to work with, so many insights. I don't know, Davis or Vickie, is there a cutting room floor scene that the thing that comes to my mind that I remember so explicitly was there was an analogy that came from one of our subjects, Tim Kendall. Not an analogy, but this is the guy who built the business model at Facebook, and he shared with us the inspiration that they got at Facebook from Google. And at Google, when they were like short on a quarter and they were not making all the money that they expected to make for that quarter, they could literally just change a couple of lines of code and change the size of the font of the advertisements, and Google could invent $100 million out of thin air in the last couple of days before their financial fiscal quarter ended.
Folding the font slightly.
It just completely blew my mind that a handful of people could change a couple of lines of code and generate that much money, have that much influence and power over civilization. And that's the asymmetric power that our subjects constantly spoke about. You know, we don't understand how this stuff is affecting us. That's a small example in many ways, but it had such a huge impact on the way I understood the technology.
So this was being made between 2018 and 19. If you guys were to think about, you know, getting started with this project in a COVID environment, do you think there's anything that would have changed around how you're talking about the way that we're using technology, you know, because we've become so much more dependent on it during the pandemic, perhaps? Anything like that you would have, you know, added to the storyline to flesh out?
I was just going to say, I hear this from you, Jeff, in different sort of Q&As that we've had around the film about like really wanting to make a distinction between the business model that is used by big social like Facebook and Google and their subsidiary companies, and the ways in which their business model is inherently manipulative and it's inherently bad for society, versus all other, like so many other kinds of technology that we've come to rely on to connect during the times of COVID that are not necessarily tracking our every move in order to figure out how to manipulate our behavior and then sell us to the highest bidder. So I think that like if we were to make the film in the time of COVID, maybe one thing that we could make even more clear is that it's this business model behind certain tech companies, which is why they are the richest companies in the history of humankind, but it's also why they're the most dangerous companies in the history of humankind. So that doesn't necessarily apply to that doesn't apply to like a phone call with my mom because I can't see her because she's far away. So there's just that distinction I think is helpful to think about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think too, what you guys are mentioning around the regulatory front, we're seeing so much happening with Facebook, Google, here in the US, but also internationally in terms of trying to kind of clamp down on some of their restrictions or even advertising behaviors and business models related to that. Do you think that some of the issues we're touching on in Social Dilemma are actually, we're seeing that there's any changes inside of these companies, any behaviors in their, actions, but also their business model, and how they're having to be held accountable also by the states, the cities, the countries that they're operating in.
Yeah, absolutely. The film has been out now for about 11 months, and we have our team has engaged in conversation with over 80, 85 different policymakers from around the world. And we are hearing a huge shift in tone and in tenor around what regulators and policymakers think can and needs to be done on this front. So that's been a huge, huge change on that front. From within the companies themselves, Twitter, as an example, has announced that they're exploring a different business model and a paid-for subscription model. Like, that was not on the table a year ago, right? People were not envisioning that or talking about that, and it's not something that that's been released yet, as far as I know. But they're starting to hear murmurs of those shifts happening. That's not happening from Facebook. It's not happening from Google. But we are certainly seeing that Twitter has like a different tone to the conversation. And I think the reality is, like, Twitter recognizes people would pay for some version of Twitter services, that Twitter provides a value to the public, especially journalists and news and different business leaders that really want a particular type of very quick, accessible information. There's a model there that people can pay for that can really be designed for the general public, just as Vickie was talking about the business model. This is the big challenge that we've seen coming out of big social, is that the advertising business model is just a flawed premise for how we want to run a society. So both from some murmurs within the companies and then also from policymakers, we've been hearing a huge turn of the tide around what the future is going to look like.
Can you explain a little bit more, maybe give me a couple of examples on, what are some of those solutions that are being considered? I think there's been also a lot that was mentioned in the film itself from some of your subjects who are talking about the changes that need to happen within these companies. What are some of the important highlighted ones out of those?
I think, as Vickie was mentioning, there's a systems level problem. It requires systems level change, and that occurs at various aspects. That occurs at all the touch points of the people that are designing the product. So, changes, as you were referencing, within the companies. It also is within the user. So the people that are using those products, we have the right to choose in certain ways how we engage, which ones we engage in, and in which ways. So, in the end of the film, there's the subjects that will speak to all the different ways that individually we as a team have changed the way that we use and interact with social media. I myself am not on social media anymore. That's not for everyone. But the reality is that many people, if you turn off notifications, you're not going to get pinged and distracted. They're very easy, simple solutions, but at a systems level problem, my individual behavior and that change is not going to change and solve that issue for the whole world. And so then that comes to regulators and using collective will and our individual voices to speak truth to power, in a sense, and make sure that the regulators do have an eye on these companies. So we really feel like change needs to happen at all of those levels, and individuals are the start of that.
Right. And policymakers are talking through antitrust, they're talking through Section 230 reform, they're talking through protection of kids and youth. So those are just a couple of examples of things that policymakers have been elevating, trying to not go too wonky right now as well. But I do think that the real needs and where the policymakers need to head to are the things that get to the underlying causes and the systemic challenges. And how do we actually shift the business model itself? How do we actually separate attention as being a metric where the companies are optimizing for and profiting off of, with going hand in hand with that advertising business model. So those are some of the conversations that I think policymakers are just now learning about. If you compare the Senate hearings from a couple of years ago to earlier this year, they are night and day different, where our legislators didn't really understand how the technology operated a couple of years ago. And as of this year, I think they're really coming around. They're getting a good sense of what's going on and what harms are coming out of it, especially with events like January 6th and with COVID misinformation that are affecting our society at large, where we have bipartisan support and bipartisan recognition that something is not working in the way this technology is designed.
Definitely. I think, Larissa, you touched on an earlier point. I was going to ask each of you, actually, if, do you have any personal dilemmas when it comes to social media or technology? And were there any surprises or, changes in your beliefs, I guess, after getting involved with a project like this?
Yeah, I can start and maybe we can go around because I'm sure everybody has a different answer than I do. But as I said, I am not on social media anymore, and that choice isn't for everyone. But one of the subjects in the film talks about if there are enough people who are outside of the matrix to have a conversation, we can have a conversation in that way. But I think for me, it was really a recognition of how this device was actually impeding my relationships, and how social media felt like a connection. But it was one of the subjects in the film that landed on the cutting room floor actually was talking about the difference between connection and connectivity. And that connectivity is what I have when I am scrolling through social media, but connection is what I get when I have a FaceTime with one of my best friends. So that's my personal journey, but maybe I'll pass it to Davis and then we can go around.
Well, I certainly have stopped using social media compared to the way I was using it before I started working on this project. I was never a big participant in the whole thing to start with, just because I always felt like I never wanted to say anything to everyone at the same time. But there, for me, there's still a dilemma of just trying to keep up with what's happening in the world and feeling disconnected, because I don't get to see things on Instagram or see things on Facebook. So I haven't committed completely to getting off the platforms, but I certainly try not to use them, and I'm much more informed about the way they're sort of harvesting information from my behavior when I do.
Yeah, I think after the first or second interview, I was about ready to throw my phone out the window. I think like all of us. But I think what I kind of honed in on was the positive aspects of social media too. I know as a musician, it's an incredibly powerful tool to connect with other musicians and to be inspired. And so that's kind of how I've used it. I think in my own personal life, I definitely have a bigger buffer between me and my social media platforms where, if I ever have the urge to go use it, I kind of look internally and try to understand why I have this feeling of wanting to use it. I definitely use it in a totally different way than I used to.
Vickie, are you on social media still? I don't know.
No, I'm not. I haven't bothered to delete my accounts because I tried once and it was like a labyrinthian thing that was like, they were like, are you sure? Maybe you just want to deactivate. What about this? What about that? And so what I did was I removed the apps from my phone, and I actually found that I really just sort of stopped checking them all together after that. I signed back onto Instagram to promote The Social Dilemma when it came out on on Netflix, and it told me that I hadn't been on for 52 weeks. So I was like, oh, okay. But for me, the wake up moment was learning more about the way that the algorithm was having real world negative consequences on like a really large scale in places that are nowhere near me that I don't get to see. Like when I learned about the genocide in Myanmar, where 800,000 Rohingya Muslims lost their lives or were displaced because of a social media storm on Facebook that was a bunch of fake information. That to me was like, oh gosh, like I don't want to feed this monster, this Frankenstein's monster, with my data to make it better at manipulating people all over the world, because there are real consequences for it getting better and better and better at knowing how people function. And there's no way to not feed it data if you're on there at all, because it's tracking your scrolling speed, it's tracking your movements, it's tracking what you stop and look at and all the other things, and so many more things that we were able to include that we were not able to include in the film. But I think, Jeff, you have said it's like 29,000. They know like 29,000 data points about 3 billion users.
I think that number is higher now, but yeah, the number of data points that Facebook has on each and every one of us, it's in the multiple tens of thousands for all.
Yeah. So I think that to me was like, whilst I feel like my life might be okay if I kept checking Instagram. I didn't like the feeling of checking it anymore because it felt like feeding the beast. And I knew that there were those real world consequences. And those circle right back around to consequences in the United States too, even if it's not as obvious.
Richard? Yeah. Jump in.
Yeah. So I think I joined Facebook in 2007 when I was in high school, and I'd say by the time I was at college, I started noticing there were things about Facebook in particular, which was really the main one I was on. Things I didn't like is perhaps too strong, but was unsure of. I went to a music college, so every day people were saying, come to this gig, come to this, and it was just, there was a lot of noise. And I remember by the time I was sort of in my final year, I made a very pointed decision not to add to the noise. And since then, I sort of allowed myself, because in the field I'm in, as sort of Mark alluded to, there are many benefits to being on these platforms. So I sort of limited myself and allowed myself like one professional post a year I was allowed to post on my personal Facebook page, figuring and then pointing people to my website and just like if they want the noise, they can find it there, but not to put it on them. And to Davis's point about not feeling like they wanted to post something for everyone to read, I often try and think of interactions I have on social media and apply them to the real world. So sort of the birthdays were always an odd thing because people would either like post on someone's wall saying happy birthday, and I always think, well, I'm just running around saying to everyone who might see it, happy birthday to John, Sarah, happy birthday to Philip. Like it's just something wasn't quite right about that. So whenever it would be someone's birthday and Facebook would notify me, or maybe I already knew, I always would reach out like directly either through a message or a text message or or a phone call, or so that. And I don't know, even events like this, I sort of imagine like a comedy sketch where you're just out in the real world, but you're holding up a mirror next to the person's face so you can see yourself, and you're constantly there are so many, not to say any of these things are wrong necessarily, but I always find it an interesting mental exercise to sort of take the interactions we have online and apply them to the real world. But it sort of culminated when I worked on The Social Dilemma, and learned from watching the film, but also speaking to all these wonderful people about the additional conversations they had, that I made the decision for myself to sort of pull myself off a little over a year ago now. And then like Vickie, I went back on after a while to promote the release of the Social Dilemma. And Facebook, thank you for completely redesigning the whole thing. So I could barely figure out how to make a post. And by the time I had figured that out, I was like, I can't be done with this. Anyway, so I pulled off again. So yeah, I still have an active Twitter account, though I rarely check it because they don't let you sort of deactivate it. Yeah, I'm off of Facebook, I'm off of Instagram. And for me, at least, it was just about weighing up the pros and the cons. And for now, at least, the cons are outweighing the pros. And like Larissa said, it's not necessarily the option for everyone. But for me, for now, it's the best choice.
Jeff?
Yeah, I've stopped using all social media in the process of making the film, and to say that it changed my entire relationship with tech is an understatement. But I really try not to use. I actually really try not to use anything that's free anymore. And I'm actively looking for the things that provide value that I want an exchange in value for, and I want to pay for, whether that's my news or applications or what have you. But yeah, I've basically stopped all social media.
I will say our team has probably not been as good about ceasing our use of Google products.
Google's tricky. We've actually really actively removed. We didn't make this film using Google products, which was challenging in terms of like Google Documents, Google Drive. We avoided that for the whole making of the film. But Google Mail, like Gmail, has become such a backbone, and I haven't seen a quality replacement. And the friend of mine who uses a different mail server, like all of his emails bounce back. And so like we need a really good replacement there.
Have you heard of Proton Mail?
I have heard of Proton Mail, and I do have a friend who uses that. Great, yeah. We'll take a look into Proton. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for sharing on that. I think sometimes it is a very personal decision. To the point about privacy and concerning surveillance, is there a difference, do you all think, in terms of being inactive versus going all the way to deleting and making the effort to actually remove your content and make sure that they're not storing anything anymore? Which is contributing less to the problem, I guess, in a way?
It's a really great question. I'm happy to jump in. I think the challenge here is that this is a whole systemic challenge, that they've built an entire business model out, and in some ways, like, there's the personal protection level, but then there's, as Vickie and others are saying, like the entire systems level. I draw the analogy often to climate change, where maybe I don't want to drive or fly, but my individual actions aren't actually going to make a huge net difference in the global scope of climate change. And there's the tension and the balance between individual actions adding up versus top-down regulation that would be the most effective, and in some cases the only way to solve these issues. So I think the same thing applies to Google's business model and to Facebook's business model. At the individual level, you can be protecting yourself and protecting, targeting for you and protecting your own data, which kind of goes down a different path. And so all of those practices are really valuable for the individual. But if we need a lot more people to be making those individual changes to shift. Now, the exciting thing is that I think there has been enough of a shift in the zeitgeist that we're starting to see new business models. We're starting to see new companies be born. We're seeing social media companies that are not designed around the advertising business model, like Clubhouse, for example. We're seeing new search engines. Neva is a new search engine that came from the Google executives and engineers who are saying we're sick and tired of Google, and they're making a subscription model of a search engine. And those are really exciting shifts that we're seeing just starting to be born now in the last year or two. So my hope is that those trends continue, and that more and more organizations and companies come out like that say, look, we're giving users a choice and we're giving them a different path, and you don't need to be victim to this advertising surveillance manipulation engine, and there are different ways you can have social connection and have the information that you want on the internet without those business models.
Were there any points in throughout the film, I think there was maybe toward the end, Tristan was talking, he was giving a talk, and it was showing around his speech saying that this is checkmate on humanity, something along those lines. And for me, that was kind of the moment that made me take a pause. And, after seeing the whole thing, I was just left there sitting on my couch being like, what are we supposed to do now, in terms of that? So
that's how we felt the entire process of making this movie, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. So was that kind of like, what your guys' expectation was for people who are going through and watching this, to get that reaction, or just be taken aback and then sit there and kind of think about their personal connection to it, their personal involvement, and their personal life within all of this?
Well, yeah, I touched on it a little bit before. When the more we worked on the film and the more people we interviewed, the more serious we realized this issue was. And I think one of the things we struggled the most with was figuring out how to make it, how to get that to come across, how to make it scary enough, And I can just speak for myself that as we were finishing the film and COVID was spreading around the world. And at the time we were seeing misinformation about that, about how you catch it from different kinds of food, or you can like all kinds of ridiculous misinformation that was coming out, and we tried to incorporate some of that into the film as we were finishing it. But to see now how disinformation spread on social media has affected our ability to react to a public health emergency like this is astonishing, but also not a surprise. And the other thing that happened, obviously, is the events of January 6th. We struggled to come up with a narrative where something like that could happen and it would feel believable. And then not long after our movie came out, something like that did happen. And it just I think when it comes to the idea of checkmate humanity, I think what scares me the most is goes all the way back to what initially got Jeff interested in this, and is that notion of the filter bubbles that we all find ourselves within, and the fact that because of these platforms, we're not sharing the same reality anymore. And I think for us to work together and to move forward, we have to kind of agree on a few, basic facts, and that's just getting harder and harder. And I think that's, I hope, is one of the big takeaways from the film.
I was curious about when you're thinking about making a documentary piece, there's so many interviews that are interwoven together and people come back on and say different things. So maybe Mark or Richard, can you talk about some of the non-visual elements that you guys used, and what was your approach in thinking about how to bring in, some of those elements into the piece?
Sure, I can start. Yeah, I think the big challenge was, all these different formats featured in the film. There was documentary, narrative, animation, archival footage. So how do you kind of tie all of these together? And I think originally the discussions around a film score were about, what does the narrative world sound like versus what does the documentary side sound like? And I think what we landed on was, could we kind of start in two different places? Start in one place where we have on the narrative side, you have more orchestral kind of acoustic human elements at the beginning, and then play off of on this other side of the world where Ben's digital doppelganger is kind of taking shape. You have this digital electronic kind of score. But as the film kind of progresses, the music side, the human side starts to break down, and it gets infiltrated by all of these digital synthesizer elements. I think some people associate the movie to like a horror film. I think there's nothing scarier than having something familiar, starting with something very familiar, and then without even kind of noticing, you have this underlying current of music kind of shift and disrupt and make you feel uneasy towards the end.
On the sound side, I mean, like Mark said, with all the different various elements at play, made it for quite a unique project. I mean, I've worked on a couple of documentary drama hybrid projects before, but this was the first one that really sort of cut between them in such a fashion that they were really sort of playing off each other, as opposed to sort of having large definitive chapters of documentary, then drama, then documentary. So there are some moments in this, especially during the climax, during the riot, where it's almost like shot from shot, you're going from drama to archival to an interview headshot back to the drama. And for us, I think, and the music certainly did a lot of the heavy lifting in this regard, but to try and create some sort of sense of cohesion, that this was a film, and sort of trying to elevate some things especially on the documentary side that you typically might not bother with, such as when Tristan Harris is walking down a long hallway to speak before Congress, adding in those footsteps and giving a better, slightly more dramatic sense of that space, not to the degree where we're trying to be manipulative, but trying to give it a slightly more dramatic edge to even, to the documentary side, so that it can sort of stand at that same aesthetic level that the drama does. So that was a fun challenge. And then obviously within the drama, it's not just sort of like a straight walkie-talkie drama, as has been mentioned, and anyone who knows the film, there are these sort of high concept locations and spaces and characters that are very sort of demanding of original sound design. And I think for some of that stuff, it was trying to find the balance of, obviously the film has a perspective and a point of view and a message it's trying to get across, but not trying to make, say, the sound of the room that they're in or the AI console too dark and sinister, but trying to go for more of trying to take the sort of the human, as Mark was saying, put the human into the score, trying to take the human elements out of those locations and out of those characters. And for instance, one very subtle thing we did is we did some vocal processing on the three AI characters, which is very subtle, but I think it really helps sort of detach them a little bit from, because it's a very human performance. Each of the three AIs has a very distinct character. It's very well done. And I think, sound as well as music and the way the whole film was put together brought so much in trying to get some of those tonal elements across between all the different sections.
If I can just praise for a second, Richard and Mark did such a phenomenal job with, as Richard was just sharing, there are lots of subtle things, and sound is so often overlooked in films, but Richard and Mark really hit it out of the park with this one, and being able to create the soundscape and the soundtrack that took people on the emotional journey. And it is very subconscious. It's very like not in your face, but it just went with the architecture and the structure of the film, and played with the journey that we were trying to have the audience follow and go through, to be able to experience that as the film was unfolding. So just huge kudos for the work there.
Yes, I just want to say ditto. I get the joy of just like once I write it and we've come to a picture lock and we know the movie shot for shot, I step away, and the first time I get to hear the score or the sound is at the premiere, and it's like it makes everything come together. It's totally the icing on the cake that makes it feel like a real movie.
Yes.
I actually did feel like I was watching a horror movie, because all these things you guys are talking about are terrifying.
Yeah, and we were struggling just to that point.
Yeah.
We really, in the blend between the documentary and the narrative elements and that balance there, what we kept coming back to is like, I always wanted the audience to know that this is true. Right, that you're seeing all of these experts, that you are getting these insider stories, and that you don't have any question in your mind that this is a true thing that we're talking about, with honest reflections from experts. And we really had to balance the narrative elements to be able to support and elevate that without overwhelming it. There are narrative films that talk about really important issues, but you leave and you're like, oh, somebody just wrote that script and it can't really be that bad, or what have you. Yeah, right. And we can brush things off sometimes if it seems too embellished. But even with the creative liberties we were taking with this film and with the narrative elements, it was all based on the expert testimony and the insider stories of like, no, this is how algorithms actually work. This is actually what's happening to each and every one of us on our feeds. These analogies we were bringing to life visually, but they were the ways that we learned from the experts how this technology worked. And so that was something we wanted it to. I don't think the goal was necessarily a horror film, yet the reality is a horror film. Like, the reality of the world right now is that this is a very scary reality that we live in, the way the technology is designed. And so I do think a lot of people came away with that feeling because that is how shocking it was to us as well.
And just to bolster up some of that, in sort of, I guess, integrity would be the word that they took when making the film. I remember when I was doing the sound design, I had an idea I was really excited about, which was, there are some classroom scenes where there's a professor giving a lecture. Meanwhile, Ben, the son in the family, is sort of preoccupied on his phone. And we cut in and out of the classroom and the AI space. And I remember, people talk occasionally of the Amazon Echo devices, or are they all listening to us? Because you'll be messaging something or saying something, and then 2 days later you get an advert for that thing. And so I suggested to Jeff and Larissa at the time, I was like, what if in the AI world we actually pipe in the dialogue of the professor giving their lecture into that space, so we sort of, without like hitting the audience over the head with it, give them that sense of this is happening. And at least at the time, Jeff told me, actually there isn't enough evidence. No one knows for sure if that's happening, or maybe that it definitively is not happening exactly in that way. And so that, that potentially cool creative idea was shot down because of their commitment to demonstrating what is happening as accurately as possible to the best of their knowledge.
Richard.
Shot down gently, I hope, Richard.
That said, Google and Amazon are listening to you if you use those devices, but Facebook, apparently, we understand that Facebook and Twitter and some others are not listening. But this is where it's challenging when you're reflecting on an entire industry and all of these manipulative practices and techniques. Yeah. It was a good idea, though, Richard.
It was a great idea.
For the sequel.
I'm rethinking it now. Yeah.
Maybe that's a good transition question into, wrapping up our conversation today, is with there being so much more to be said, around this topic. I think, Jeff, you mentioned earlier that there was consideration to make this into a series. So, is there going to be more on this project to follow up on? Is there a part 2 coming?
Yeah.
What should we
We've discussed through this and thought through this as well. Part of the painful reality right now is that these issues are so dire that I don't feel like we have the time to make another film, that the strategic objectives of spending another 3 years or so making a film on this is less effective than some of the policy work and some of the conversations, just getting this film in front of the policymakers to try to shift the conversation. So our team at Exposure Labs, we've been focusing on that very effort in terms of how do we engage with politicians, with policymakers, and with tech, and keeping the public pressure on the tech companies, and prioritizing that over making a sequel, for example.
I will also just point people to the socialdilemma.com website, because there are a number of other resources, be it podcasts, books, even other films like Coded Bias, which speak to different elements of this issue that are not included in our film, but are equally as important, if not more so, for people to be aware of, and also to use their collective will and bargaining power.
Yeah, definitely. If there's any other films, podcasts, I mean, there's so much material, right, coming out, I think, around just how we can start using other kinds of social media alternatives, or even look at ways of not being on social media and how to think about that. But thank you, all of you, for a very, very great conversation today around tech, around big tech in particular, and a lot of these important issues as shown in the social dilemma. It was great to have all of you join us. Thank you again, and just be sure to take advantage of the free trial that's going on in Wrap Pro, where you can learn more about the upcoming screenings, just like this one, and any upcoming events that we have. You can also register for upcoming screenings on there and look at some of the archives of our past screenings. So thank you all for joining us for this conversation today.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.